her immunity will not allow it. She would just not be able to handle any anesthesia. So in 2 minutes, your world just crumble. You're like, whoa, how am I able to function after this news? And actually, there's something in your brain that either make you fight, flight, or freeze. And I think I froze, and I had to freeze because I had to call my husband, my sisters, my dad. I had to make all these phone calls to tell them the news, and then I had to go back to the room and just face my mom looking totally normal.
Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives, in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode. Well, welcome to today's podcast. Today will be just a little different. I usually record these podcasts using an audio format and of recording. Today we're doing this via Zoom because we know how to roll with the punches.
Exactly.
Right? That's how it is. So today we're doing via Zoom. So it'll be a little different because I'm actually seeing the person I'm speaking. Usually I'm just listening. So anyway, I have the honor of inviting you all to listen to Patricia de Picciotto's, am I saying it right? De Picciotto's.
Yes, fine.
Patricia de Picciotto's story, grief journey today. And Patricia and I met through Instagram. She reached out and said she normally does these little shares people's stories on her Instagram page. And then we just chatted another day, and we're just kind of doing this interview now, and then we'll hop on and do one on her Instagram. And so sharing our stories with the world. So Patricia, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So glad that you're here. So tell us a little bit about you. I know that I already know a little bit, but I want the listeners to hear a little bit about you, where you grew up and where you live now.
So I grew up in Geneva, Switzerland. My parents were both Lebanese. They left Lebanon at the end of the 70s. I was born in Hong Kong because my father was working there. And then they moved to Geneva, Switzerland.
How old were you when you moved from Hong Kong to Geneva?
I was a year old.
Okay.
So I don't really remember Hong Kong, but I have two older siblings and they do have vivid memories of the years they've spent there. But yeah, so Geneva was my hometown for 20 years. I went to school there, I went to college, and then moved to London for a few years. And then I joined my mom to Brazil. She was remarried at that time to someone in Brazil. She had left when I was, I think, 19. And when I was 23, I thought, you know what, before going, full on in the professional world, I might as well, go to Brazil for 6 months or a year, learn a new language, a new culture, get some experience. So I moved there in 2005. And luckily, like a month into, moving to Brazil, I met my future husband.
Oh,
so
found love.
Yeah,
found love in mysterious places.
He was so happy because my plan was to spend like 6 months or a year, and I ended up spending 10 years. So it was totally unpredictable, and I just stayed because I realized that they don't want to leave my mom, they don't want to leave my boyfriend. After a year, I was really fluent in Portuguese. I was able to read, to write. So then I started working in jewelry again. And I got married, had my 3 kids there, and then we moved to New York 5 years ago in 2015.
So that's quite a big change. I tell people, like, I know the grief story we're going to share has to do with the passing of your mom, but the fact of even moving, there's grief in even those components of those
Hmm.
moves. When you're starting your life all over again and leaving
Yeah.
something behind, which one of those transitions in your life do you feel was like one of those that was the hardest when you moved?
I think the hardest was when I moved to Brazil because I really didn't speak a word of Portuguese. I found it very hard to find someone who could just speak in English or in French. And I had to adapt to a whole new culture, whole new, habits, traditions. So that was a big move. But on the other hand, I had my mom there, and I knew I didn't want to be so far away for so many years. I never expected to spend like a decade in Brazil, but I knew I wanted to spend sometimes with her there. But definitely it was hard to adapt. And then moving from Sao Paulo to New York, that was a decision that me and my husband really wanted, to take, and we wanted to raise the kids there. But the day before, literally the day before we hopped on the plane to move to New York, my mom's husband, my stepfather, was diagnosed with cancer.
Ugh.
So it was heartbreaking because that was really the day I'll always remember. The day before we left on a Wednesday night. On a Tuesday afternoon, I had organized a party for my kids, like a farewell party for them. And my mother got this phone call, and she's like, the doctor just called. We need to go there. He has something to say to Simon, which was her husband. So
Mhm.
she left in the middle of the party. And a few hours later, she calls me and she's like, he needs to, be hospitalized tomorrow. That's like an emergency surgery because they found a tumor. So the next day, literally the day of my departure, she spent the day in the hospital with her husband, and she just left for a few hours to come say goodbye and then went back to the hospital. So, it was such a happy decision to move to New York. And all of a sudden, there was this cloud over our heads because I didn't want to leave anymore. At that point, I'm like, okay, now that he's sick, now that my mom's going to be, taking care of him, I can't leave, but we had to. And my kids were enrolled in school, like we had rented the apartment, we had sold the apartment in Brazil, like there was no way back. So that was bittersweet because I always wanted to move to New York. This is really something that we thought about and we've planned. And last minute, like literally in the last 24 hours, this happened.
And it should
So
be.
it
Yeah, because then
was,
you're leaving your mom and your stepdad in this very vulnerable
yeah.
time. And so it's that torn in between kind of emotions for
Mhm.
you, like you said, bittersweet.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think also when my mother left to Brazil, so I was 19, she was getting remarried, she was still young, she was like enjoying life. But all of a sudden, she had me for 10 years. She saw my kids, growing up. And it was even harder for her to say goodbye. It was much harder for her to say goodbye that time when I moved to New York, that when, she went to Brazil and I stayed in Geneva. So all those goodbyes, were always, you know, as you say, you have to grieve something that you're leaving behind.
Yes.
And for me, it was not the hardest move because I really wanted to move, but leaving my mom in that situation, knowing that my stepfather was that sick,
Yeah.
it was really scary.
That is so true. It's like we have to live those little like smaller griefs in
Mm-hmm.
order to prepare us sometimes for these other major grief changes that happen in our life. And a lot of times I feel we shelter either ourselves and even our kids from experiencing loss.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, like I was reading something the other day regarding really allowing them for example, if they lost their blankie. Like I know when
Yeah.
my kid lost his first blankie, I bought two extra ones,
Mm-hmm.
like, because I was like, I don't want him to like lose his
Yeah.
blankie again, and I don't want him to go through that pain of like, if he loses it, not to have it. And, and this is like when they were little, but those little things that we even expose our children to, like moves and things like that, as hard as they are, they do help for other aspects in
For
life,
sure.
which are much bigger transitions and that we know that are bound to happen, which in everybody's life death is one of those, right? So the death of a loved one
But it
is one
builds
of those.
resilience, because all these moves that
Yes.
I went through, in 30 years, I'm such a chameleon. I feel if my husband tell me tomorrow, oh, we're moving to that place tomorrow, I think I'm so flexible, right? And my
Mhm.
kids too, I think they would adapt easily. It really builds up a certain um
Character, a
yeah,
type of
fluidity.
character. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Resilience is the right word, and
resilience is the word.
flexibility too. Yeah, those two words are perfect for this. You're absolutely right. Okay, so now your stepdad gets diagnosed, your mom is there, you guys are here.
Yeah.
Then tell us a little bit what happened
So
then
my
afterwards.
stepfather got pretty sick, and for 3 years, from March 2015 to July 2018, he was sick. Like, he never had a day where he was cancer free. So for those 3 years, my mom was her caretaker, but she didn't have us by her side. So it was really all about him all the time. And in December 2017, that was his last surgery. And they kind of close him up and say, there's nothing we can do. It's too far away. The metastases are in his lung. There's really nothing, nothing left. So December 2017, that's when, he had to take the decision of not pursuing any treatment or surgery, and really surrender to the truth that he's not going to cure from his
Yeah.
cancer. So that
When
was,
was, sorry to interrupt you, when was where was the original tumor found?
I think, in his colon, in the,
It was
big
colon.
intestine.
So
Yeah.
colon, and then had metastasized to the lungs at that
Yeah.
point, 3 years later. Okay,
Yeah. 2 years and a half
two and a
later,
half
because
years later. Okay.
December. So at
Okay.
that point, you have to surrender to the hurtful truth. And then a month later, so January 2018, my mom, she called me one day and she's like, sorry to give those details, but it's like the color of my urine is very dark. And she always needed a push to go to the doctor. I'm like, you have to go to the doctor, see if it's not an infection. Your infection makes you sick and you can have fever. You have to check it out. She went and she did check it out, and there was zero infection. She was totally fine. They sent her back home. 3 days later, she wakes up yellow, like her skin tone is
Jaundice.
super yellowish.
Jaundice. Yeah.
Yeah. She goes straight to the doctor again, and he's like, okay, you're going for a PET scan. So that was January 11th, 2018. And January 12th, 2018, he calls her back early in the morning with the result. And he said, we found a tumor in your pancreas. Luckily, it looks small enough to have surgery. So we're going to schedule surgery for the next week. But imagine the shock of getting this news like a month after the final diagnosis of my stepfather. And at that time in the winter, there's 3 hours difference between Brazil and New York. So my sisters are in Switzerland, so that's 6 hours ahead. And my mother is in Brazil, so that's 3 hours ahead. And then there's me sleeping, and everyone's calling me. And as soon as I woke up, and I have to say, I will tell you about this, I still have like WhatsApp anxiety and phone anxiety. I feel like if I don't check my phone,
Yes.
I'm going to my
Yes.
phone and have like a bad news, because
Oh
it's
my
like,
gosh. You know what you're saying, I'm sorry, and I want you to continue that, but what you're saying right now is something that people that go through a, a loved one that has gone through, that is going through something, you
mm-hmm.
have that anxiety of not
Yeah,
of the phone, which is a little different than when you hear just a sudden, when somebody passes
yeah,
away suddenly. So there's a different type of grief component that is in that slow process, that even though you get to be in that process at the same time, I felt like, for myself, being that we share the same thing, my mom
mm-hmm.
also passed away from pancreatic cancer, is the feeling like you're holding your breath all the time,
Yeah,
not knowing when to call. Oh my gosh. Okay, so you
yeah.
wake up and then
So
you
I wake
see.
up, so many missed calls, so I need to go through the WhatsApp, right? Because I have to open the app, I have to see the messages, like which messages am I opening first. And actually, the first one was from my sister, and she's like, called me, we're trying to reach you out. The doctor called my mom. She has a tumor in her pancreas. And I had to reread the message twice because I was so used at that point to get the news from my stepfather having tumors and this and that.
Right.
And I reread and like, my mom? How come my mom is sick? Like, her husband is sick. She's not sick. So, you have to like read and reread the message. And then I don't know, I started crying, and then I called my husband, and then I tried to call my sister, but I was crying. I didn't know how to call my mom. We were all in shock, in such a shock. That day, I spent the day in bed. I couldn't do anything. My husband like canceled all his calls, everything, because we're far away. Imagine. So my sister's in Switzerland. I'm in New York. My mom is in Brazil getting these news. We're waiting on the doctor to schedule the surgery. And it was only the next day that the doctor was able to schedule the surgery. And he's like, okay, you're getting prepped on Wednesday. I think you're getting the surgery on Thursday. And I flew that weekend, and I just went to Brazil for as long as it was needed. I didn't even know how long she was going to stay in the hospital, like how she would recover from the surgery, how she would go back home. But it's those moments where you just book a ticket and leave. There's nothing else, you can do. And also, I'm the only one of my siblings who speaks Portuguese. So I always had this responsibility of taking care of all the medical, legal.
Are you the youngest?
And decisions. I'm the youngest.
Yeah.
But,
But you had to take the responsibility of being the oldest one.
I was the only one who was able to speak to the doctor. When she spent those 3 weeks in the hospital, I was the one talking to the nurses. So I slept with her at night at the hospital, because if she needed anything, like, I was the only one who was able to talk to the nurses, talk to the doctor, be the bridge between her and the medical staff. So even when her husband was sick, I think I always had this responsibility of being the one in charge of my mom, not of my mom, but helping her in the decision and talking to, as I said, doctors, lawyer, insurance. I always help her with.
But that's because you were also you had been living in Brazil. You created that other dynamic.
Yeah.
That was different than the one of your sisters, just because of also you having been the one to move there. The language, the aspect that you kind of knew the ins and outs. You knew her husband probably better than your sisters because you lived in the same place. So you helped her with those decisions, and now you're helping her with this. Did the kids stay? Was it only you that flew in?
Yeah,
They stayed in the States.
My husband with the 3 kids, and I'm like, I don't know when I'm coming back. I am coming back, but I really don't know when I'm coming back, because at that point, we just knew that she had to go through a major surgery, but we didn't know how long she would stay in the ICU, how long she would stay in the hospital, So big question mark. And there's always this thing. My husband is from Sao Paulo, so he needs to, come and work from there. He can. So there's always this thing about, like, I'm leaving, and if you have to join me, then you'll come and just take the kids out of school. And it actually happened when my mother passed. When the doctors told us that it was the end, I told my husband, you have to come. So we pulled the kids out of school, and he came and he worked from Brazil.
What you're saying there is something that I feel a lot of people don't have sometimes, that flexibility, right?
No.
To be able, because so the blessing of, one, the fact that you were able to travel, the blessing that your husband could work from anywhere, so that way you could be there in that moment. And
I know that. I had
what a blessing.
The privilege and the blessing of being able to book a ticket every time my mother needed me. I also worked for myself at that point, because I was doing art tours, so I had my own schedule. I was very flexible. I could really work the weeks I was in New York, and then the weeks I needed to be in Sao Paulo, I wasn't working. And the flexibility of my husband being able to work in both cities. So definitely.
Those are like the
and
things.
It helped me, because for 2 years, between January 2018 and November 2019, I think I've spent 15 to 16 weeks each year in Brazil.
There. So, wow.
So literally like a quarter of the year.
Now take us to the moment in which then your mom had her surgery.
Mm-hmm.
Your mom had the surgery. She had that removed. She then was fine. She did a few chemo treatments, or like tell us
She did a
because
few
something
chemo
happened
treatment, but
major.
the tumors, yeah, the tumor was removed, and it was a huge success. And they were very happy of the way, she was getting better, being able, to stand up, because like those surgery, with a huge scar, it's even hard to put one step in front of the other. She was doing great. She came back home after 3 weeks. Um, she was not independent at that time, but she could stand up, she could walk, she could do a few things on her own. And she went through just a few chemo, not so many, side effects. She didn't lose her hair at that time. She didn't have any nausea. She was okay. And then she was in remission for a few months. But those few months where she was, chemo free and tumor free, that's when her husband got terminally ill. And that was between, May and July. So
It
the
was like a
last two
ping pong. It was like a ping pong
was
match.
crazy.
It
It
was
was
like he was
insane.
sick, she
Yeah.
was taking care of him. Then
Yeah.
she was really sick, he was taking
Yeah.
care of her. And then she's in
Exactly.
remission, and then he gets sick.
And then he gets terminally ill. So as I said, since December, we're waiting on that moment to happen. And we went to Brazil again many times, but in July, I think beginning of July, end of June, he was, really at that point where, he can hardly breathe, he can hardly walk, and he didn't want to go to the hospital. He wanted to spend the last days at home. But the last week, my mother was telling me he's been falling. He's been falling. Like he cannot stand up. He stands up, he falls, but he doesn't want help. So the situation in the last days, the last week, was very complicated. And same thing, like I took a plane, went to Brazil, and I was like, okay, if you need help with him, I'm going to help you, because if he's not accepting any help of anyone else, then, someone needs to help my mom. And at that point, I got there. He was barely speaking, barely breathing. And the doctor told my mom, you should bring him to the hospital. But he didn't want to. Yeah, like he wanted to be home. And the last 2 days, I told my mom, he wants it, he doesn't want it. We're taking him to the hospital. It's too big of a responsibility to have him in the last days at home. And the pain, and,
Because you
also
needed
at
to be
that
able
point,
to
he
manage
wasn't
his
able to
pain.
swallow.
Yeah.
So how can you give morphine to someone who cannot swallow? So it was just too complicated. And, he went to the hospital, and the last 2 days we were, with him 24 hours a day until his last breath. So I was with him and with my mom in the final moments. And then I stayed another 4 weeks with my mom after his passing, because she needed to go through, the burial, the funeral, the week of prayers that were Jewish. So we did Shiva for a week, and then just all the legal, things you have to go through: lawyers, insurance, doctors, paperwork, all that stuff. So I stayed with her those 5 weeks, a week before his passing, and then 4 weeks after. So I was really trying to, to do as much as I could to help her at that point.
That is so commendable, and just again, like that is so beautiful that you were able to be there not only for his passing,
Yes.
but also for her. Now in those moments, like while he was sick, the conversation about the conversation about death come
Mm-hmm.
up, and about wishes in terms of what he wanted, for example,
So
in
no conversation with him.
nothing. Okay,
No.
how about with your
I
mom?
was the one pushing. My mom was like, try to have this conversation.
Yes.
Try to. It's like he doesn't want to speak about it. It's not that it was denial. It was a mix of, superstition, of culture, of
Yes.
of just not being a person that opens up, about fears and anxiety, and maybe a little bit of denial.
Now, how about for
There's
your
something
mom?
very strong about death in our culture. And we're Jewish, we're Middle Eastern. You don't talk too much about death, because it might happen, and you don't want to
Yeah,
put
you don't want to
the
jinx it.
word.
Yeah, it's like you're bringing, it's as if you're bringing it
Yeah.
about us, but the
Yeah.
reality is that we all are gonna die,
Yeah.
right? So it's like it's that thing, and that's the reason I know, and we'll get to this part too of what you're doing now in your own grieving process now, but um of bringing these conversations more to talking when we are
Yeah.
healthy about that and our wishes, so that it doesn't become so taboo. People create a birth story, right? They want like a birth plan. You're like, oh, so when I have my child, I would like
Hmm.
this, and I want this midwife, and I want this, and I want my husband to be there, and I want that. And then we're going to play music in the background.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe on that particular day, it doesn't go as planned. That's
Hmm.
fine. But you had some idea of what you wanted your birth to be. But it is just so opposite
Yeah,
to,
it
we
is.
don't talk about how we want
But we don't
our,
even talk about sickness. Like you don't even pronounce
yes,
the word cancer. You just
yes.
don't tell other people that you're sick. You try to hide it. You try to make it go away by hiding it, but it's just not going away. So I was pushing my mom to have the conversation. She's like, I'm not able to have this conversation. Even for her, I'm not even putting this on my stepfather because he didn't want to talk. She
Mm,
didn't want to,
admit, like, yeah.
confront the reality that it can happen, that
Mhm.
it's really happening. So they were both kind of, let's say, in denial, but it was a mix of denial and superstition. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, now he passes away. You stay there for 4 weeks.
Yeah.
You go back to New York, and then tell us then what started happening then with your mom's health a little bit.
Yeah.
And also in this time, I want to know too, what were you doing to cope with all these aspects of grief? Like you knew
Mm-hmm.
Simon pretty well. Give me a second. My dog keeps on wanting to go. Go inside.
Okay.
She wants to, she comes in, she comes out, she comes in, she comes out of the bedroom. She's like, so the door was too closed.
No
She was
worries.
just here when I was talking. Yeah. So,
I was worried for my mom at that time. Like
yeah.
yes, I was grieving him, but also I was worried for my mom as a new widow with this, cancer on her mind, because she had to go through scans every 3 months. So, I mean, we knew when the doctor told us, like, there's always a possibility, like, it can come back. It's such an aggressive cancer, you're not fully in remission. You're just having, a few months off to try to cope with the other drama that is. I really feel like she got those few weeks, off just to be able to cope with the loss. But in November, so she came to New York. That was her last trip to New York. She came to New York in October, and she had to go back to Brazil because her scan was scheduled for November 1st or November 2nd, 2018. She had the best time in New York that week. It was hard because, as I said, she was a widow, but we were really trying to make her feel, you know, that's the thing you do when someone is grieving. You try to make them forget about the loss. You try to make them feel better. You're just trying your best, to be around the person and support her. She really had a great time, a great trip with the kids. Halloween, she got dressed up. I'll have those pictures forever of my mom's last Halloween. And she went back, and we were sure, but we were really sure that she was just going back for routine scan. And she was planning to go to Switzerland. So after the trip in New York, she was planning to go to Switzerland to see my sisters for the winter season, for the winter break. So we really thought, and we had that hope that the scan was just a routine scan. And then the scan result came back, and the tumor came back. So I had to leave again. I went to Sao Paulo, talked to the doctor. What's the next step? What are we doing? She was just a widow, and now she had to deal with cancer all over again. And also the chemo he was, offering that time had the side effect of hair loss. And that
Mm,
was the first time, she was even thinking about hair loss, because I don't know, it makes it more real, like you see it every day. And I remember on that trip in November, we went to get her a wig. that was also tough. But I went with her and we chose the wig, and she tried it on and did the highlight, changed the color, and then she started her chemo, and then she went through chemo from November to June, 3 different types of chemo. And even if the tumor in her pancreas was shrinking, in June, on June 26, 2019, she got the result of one of the scans, because it was every 2-3 months, and they say she had metastasis in her liver. And at that point, it's just, the news that you don't want to get, because you can still keep your hope up, when it's about a tumor, but then metastasis in the liver, that's just bad news. And I remember that day, it was June 26th. I was dropping my kids to sleepaway camp. So I was, near the buses. The kids were in the buses. So I was able to say goodbye to the kids. They were in the bus, each one in a bus. So I was trying to wave to one, to wave to the other. Then the phone rang, and it was my mom. And she told me, I have this metastasis in the liver. So I started crying. And I remember there's a dad that came, and he's like, don't worry, your kids will be fine.
No.
So people thought I was crying. I had to put my sunglasses. People thought I was crying because my kids were leaving. And I just got this news. And then I totally forgot about the kids. I'm like, I don't even know that my kids are on the bus. That's it. They're gone. They're off to camp. I was just focused on the news. And it was such a shock, because once again, you always keep your hopes up, and you want a good result from the scan. You want the tumor to shrink. You want to have the hope that even if she has to live with this treatment, it's going to last a little longer. But when you have this news, it's, how much hope can you have? But we still tried. And at that point, her doctor and another doctor in New York told her about this treatment, which was really something that was not common, and it was experimental. And she was like, okay, I'm going for this. It was impossible for her in June to take the decision that her husband took like a year and a half before, like, okay, there's no more treatment, like, I'm not trying anything anymore, I'm just gonna wait. It wasn't in her character to accept it. Like, she was really going to fight. So we spoke to the doctor in Brazil, the doctor in New York, and they were like, okay, let's try it. That's really the last hope, but it could work, So once again, we're all hopeful and, waiting for this treatment. So the treatment had to be shipped, I think, from the States to Brazil. It was not available in Brazil. So we got that treatment. I went to Brazil. It was August. And she was okay for the first days after the treatment. And then she got a major infection on top, because her immunity was so low because of that treatment. And she got this major infection on top of her treatment, on top of her immunity that was super low. And that's it. She just went downhill from that moment on. And she spent a month in the hospital, which was, that was the turning point. Like, she was fine, even with chemo, even with all the news, she was still with a normal appearance. She had her wig, but she looked great. She was hopeful. She wanted to live. At that point, after a month in the hospital, she was a different person. She had lost so much weight. She had lost, autonomy. She had no more strength. She had no more appetite. So that was when, we really looked at her like a sick person. For those year and a half when she was, battling with cancer, she was normal. Like, we knew she was having chemo, but she looked normal. She lived normally. She was fine. But at that point on, that's it. That was downhill. And then
that was September then. So August through September that she was in the hospital?
August to September. Then she came back home for a little bit.
Were you in Brazil still? Were you still in Brazil?
At that point, I think I'm more in Brazil than in New York. Like,
okay.
I'm basically in Brazil. And I had to come back to school for the kids, but then I left the next week, and then I came back, and then I left for Yom Kippur. I was in Brazil. and my kids were able to come because they had a break in October. My mom was at home at that time. I think the doctor sent her home for a few weeks, but she could barely, she could barely walk. She still needed help for everything. And then I remember my sister was in Brazil and she left on a Sunday night, Sunday, October 27th. Monday, October 28th, my mom is really not feeling well. And the doctor tell her, come to the hospital right now. And they made us, I know she had another scan and they saw water in her lung. And at that point, my sister is in a plane because it's an overnight flight. It's still early morning for me. So one more, situation where I wake up and my mom is going to the hospital in emergency. It's like 7:30 in New York. My sister is not reachable because she's in a plane. And once again, I rush and I leave that same night. And she just spent the rest of the time in hospital until she passed.
Were you able to be there when she passed away?
I knew from that day on, I was with her.
Were you there the day she passed away?
Yes. I was sleeping in the hospital, so I was there. And that was October 28th when she was hospitalized again. October 31st, the doctor sees me in the hallway and I was still wearing my PJ because I was sleeping in the hospital and I was like barefoot in my PJ, and he wanted to come in the room and I'm like, she's sleeping. Can you, is it important? And he's like, no, actually, I wanted to talk to you. And just like this, I will never forget that scene. It's like in a movie. Just like this, in front of the door, like it looked like an ER episode, he just announced me. We got the result. There's nothing else they can do. She's way too weak now. The infection has spread. The metastases have spread. She cannot undergo any treatment or surgery. Like her immunity will not allow it. She would just not be able to handle any anesthesia. So in 2 minutes, your world just crumble. You're like, whoa, how am I able to function after this news? And actually there's something in your brain that either make you fight, flight, or freeze. And I think I froze, and I had to freeze because I had to call my husband, my sisters, my dad. I had to make all these phone calls to tell them the news. And then I had to go back to the room and just face my mom looking totally normal, because I asked the doctor, I'm like, you're the doctor, you're telling her I'm not going through this. I'm not telling her that it's over. And he's like, okay, I'll come back tomorrow and I'll tell her the news. So for 24 hours, I was acting as if nothing had happened. I was just waiting for the doctor to announce it to my mom, because I didn't have, the courage. And I don't think it was my responsibility to announce her. I mean, my responsibility was to support her, but to tell her this, I think he needed to do it. So the next day he comes with a psychologist, and my mom requests that I'm present. And I'm like, I know what he's going to say, and I don't want to be here, but she wants me here. So I'll never forget those 2 days, October 31st and November 1st. It was just, the minute where your world shifts and a new realities start to, sink in, because you need to prepare. And I think this is where the anticipatory grief starts. You need to prepare yourself for a world without her, but actually nothing prepares you, because I was, at that point I was trying to, Google life after loss, mother loss, grief. I was on Amazon, trying to buy books, and I was, looking for podcasts, but actually nothing really prepares you for that.
Yeah, because even if you read things, nobody's experience is going to be exactly what you're living. So as much as
it's the absence, it's like you can prepare yourself,
Yeah.
but she's still here. It's the absence. It's
Mm-hmm.
not being able to see her, to talk to her,
Yeah.
to, even the last days where she was not responsive from Tuesday to Friday, I was still in the room 24/7. I was in the hospital. She was still there. She was unconscious, but she was there. So even those days where I was not able to interact with her, I was still able to hold her hand. She was present. So nothing prepares you to the absence of the
Mm.
person. Like,
Now, she passed away. So when you were talking about the October 31st and then November 1st, I was thinking of how you had just described her being in New York just a year before for
yeah,
Halloween and all those pictures and those moments. So here's a whole year later that it looks completely different. Same month, same year, very opposite emotions going on.
totally
So then when
crazy. That's
her,
exactly what I thought. It's
yeah,
crazy what can happen in a
yeah.
year. And then I
And
told the doctor, you ruined Halloween for me. Like now, every year, for me, October 31st is the day that the doctor announced me that my mom was
told you.
going to die. Like,
And it
how
is
could I
still
think
now
about
because it's
Halloween anymore?
right, but it's also because it's so recent that still
Mm-hmm.
relating to that is what your mind goes to. But I can say that eventually it may kind of start shifting. For my family, my dad's birthday is December 20th. My sister passed away December 17th. Her burial was December
Oh
20th.
my
So
God.
for many years, my dad would be like, "Why were we celebrating it? Today is the day she was
Yeah.
buried." We're like, "She didn't die today. This is your birthday too. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
she was buried on your birth. So it does weigh for
Mm-hmm.
sometime those kind of things when they happen. But it will dissipate a little bit as you start experiencing more October 31st that end up filling you with joy, um and then that memory will just become a little bit more faint in the background
Mm-hmm.
of the doctor telling
Yeah.
you the
But
final.
something special happened the next day because I was on Instagram and then I saw a very, very, very good childhood friend of mine had moved to Mexico, and that it was November 1st, so it was Dia de los Muertos.
Mm-hmm.
And she had just recently lost her aunt to cancer. Her aunt was not Mexican. She was not Mexican, but because she was living there, she's like, you know what? I'm just going to honor, my aunt on this day. And, I texted her and I'm like, it's really, you have no idea how impactful was your post because, as I said, now October 31st and November 1st were the bad news, the end of the world news. And now maybe eventually, as you said, I'll be able to shift it and be a day of remembrance of my mom and of her passing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it's going to happen this year, but my friend was able, to shift and celebrate her aunt on that day.
Yes, and it's
So
it's it's
maybe
having
one day.
grace and it's having grace and patience and give me 1 second. My daughter just started a clarinet lesson. Hold on. This is one thing I forgot. I forgot that my daughter, now that they're in school, can you hear the clarinet?
No,
Could you hear? Okay, I hope the microphone doesn't pick it up, but the computer microphone. So now it's like I could hear it in the background. I'm like, oh no, because now that they're in school, she now has clarinet during her band class, but at home, So
you
uh,
have to hear everything. Yeah.
yes, so but now I have to know, okay, what time is it? So that I know, okay, now I'll know I can't plan recording during her band class.
Yeah. No, but I can't hear anything.
Okay, good, good. So what I was gonna say is that yeah, having grace and patience with ourselves in those processes,
Mm-hmm.
that it doesn't just happen overnight. It doesn't. And for some people, their journey is a little bit quicker, and some is harder. So just having grace. So your mom passed away. I want to know more. If you can share with the listeners or viewers, whichever
Mm-hmm.
method we share this, what what are some of the things you've done in this process of your grieving process? Because it hasn't even been a year yet, Patricia. So you starting the Instagram account was one
Hmm.
of those things. So tell us a little bit about that aspect of your grief.
So when my mother passed away, I was in a meditation group that I used to see every week. That helped me a lot because I started, meditating when my mother was sick and when my stepfather was getting really sick. Like that was the point, I think, around May 2018, where I had so much anxiety because I was like, whoa, my mom is sick. He's getting sicker and sicker. That means she's going to be a widow very soon. How do I handle this with the distance and being in New York? It helped me so much. I had to really, stop thinking about the future. Like the mindfulness really helped me to focus on the present. At that point, I realized that there's nothing you can plan. Like one day I was like planning for my birthday. The following morning, I know that my mom has a tumor in her pancreas. Same for, you're hopeful that this surgery, is gonna cure her, and then 2 days later, oh no, but the result came back and it has spread. So at that point I realized there's nothing I can plan. So mindfulness helped me to just focus on the present. I couldn't, let my mind go too far in the future, like how's gonna be life without her, how's gonna be, my kids graduation without her, how's gonna be my 50th birthday without her, or whatever. So mindfulness really on a daily basis, just like gratitude exercises and meditation, have helped me just focus on the day or maybe the week, but not more than this, because otherwise your mind and your fears can take
Mm,
you in such a dark place. Because also when you lose someone, you kind of face your own mortality, right? So
absolutely. Yeah.
do I really want to think about something can happen to me? Who's going to take care of my kids? Like, I don't want to go there. And it can happen, but I don't want to go there. So all the mindfulness that I do is really to try to bring me back to right now, to the present, or to just, this period of my life, not too far away. This helped me a lot, but I think I've just respected myself at the beginning. I came back to New York. I remember there was, a lunch that I organized at synagogue in memory of my mom. And at the very last second, I'm like, I'm not going. I told my husband, you go with the kids. I'm not able to face 40, 50, 60 people. Hearing one more, I'm sorry, my condolences, I just cannot doing. So I think at the beginning, I was very respectful of my space, only allowing myself to see the few very intimate friends I wanted to see,
Hmm.
and not putting myself in the situation where you have to smile or you have to listen to small talk. And actually this lasted for a long time. I think the first time I was able to go back to school, to my kids' school, was end of January or February, maybe 2, 3 months after my mother passed, because I didn't want to see people. I didn't want to go through small talks. I didn't want to hear about their, Christmas break or their February break. I just didn't want that. So I was very good at respecting my pace, my space, myself. And then COVID started. And that's like a whole other story, because I was happy to be home, but like really, like when it started, I was like, oh my God, this is a blessing in disguise, without obviously knowing about the proportion it was going to take and all the death. But I'm like, oh, finally I can like not go to work and be home and not have to go to school and not have to say no to all the lunch dinners and social and professional, obligations you have. So I'm just home with myself, with my family, and I needed that. But then it starts being very lonely,
Mm.
because not only you're alone and you're isolated, and my family is 10,000 miles away and I cannot travel because of the travel bans, but also COVID is on everyone's mind. So there's nothing else people are talking about. So you're slowly but surely forgotten,
Mm.
and no one, people just stop checking on you. They stop asking about you, about your grief. And it really became a very isolated place for me. And I ended up joining a grief group online on Facebook. So at first it was great, I was able to, to connect with other motherless daughters, or, people who went through similar losses, a
Mhm.
parent loss, father loss, or mother loss. Then it became overwhelming. The group had 50,000 people. They were just too many tragedy and losses, and it was hard for me to deal with my grief and with so many people's grief. So I just started this page, and at the beginning for like a month I was posting, but it wasn't even public. It was just like me and my Instagram
Your
page with
own
like,
way. Yeah, it's
yeah,
kind of
with
like
different
your, as if it
quotes and
was your journal,
recording.
like your
Yeah, I
journal.
just wanted to post about my mom. I wanted to vent. I was posting in that online group on Facebook, but it was just too much. There were just too many people. So I was like, I'm just gonna post there. And also want to separate myself from my professional Instagram. And I didn't want to see what was happening in other people's life. I didn't want to see what was happening in the museums. Anyway, everyone was on lockdown. So I wanted like a new start with accounts that I would follow that would be only about grief. Like this is what I needed at that point. I needed to connect with people. I needed to share my story. I needed to find an online support because I was not getting a physical support. And a few weeks later, I was like, okay, let me try to make the account public. And I did. And I even announced on my other Instagram, my professional one, that I was, taking a time off. Anyway, I'm not able to work for maybe another year now. So I was going to focus on the online grief community. And it really started like this, like posting about my mom, putting some quotes. I never planned about, having lives or talking to other people, but it happened naturally because naturally you DM someone, then you chat with someone, then you realize that, oh, that person lost her mom 2 days before me. Oh, this happened, that happened. And organically you're starting to listen to other people's stories, and it's healing for me to listen to them, but it's also healing for them to share. And at that point I realized that sharing your story is not for the recognition on social media or for gratification. It's really to help someone else. And it started with a podcast that I had done with a therapist. She wanted to interview me about grief and loss. And then I had such a feedback, even from friend of mine who never went through loss, but they were like, oh, this is so eye-opening to know how to deal with someone who's grieving. So then with that same therapist, we ended up scheduling a live to have the feedback from the podcast and to answer more questions. And it just started. And then I was like, you know what, I want to listen to your story, and I want to listen to your story. And I was just reaching out to accounts that were so helpful for me. But then also people started reaching out to me. I'd like to talk about the loss of my dad. I'd like to talk about the loss of I, I was just open to hear about any losses. I think that every loss is unique, every grief is unique, but there is a common thread. Somehow you'll always be able to understand what the other one is going through. Even though you're not going through the same loss, you do understand, the pain, and also the fact that grief is forever. And you're not going to judge that person because that person is still in pain after like 12 years, 18 years, 24 years.
Yes.
And now I've done, I think, over 25 or 26 lives. I've been doing, many podcasts. And I just needed that. It's therapy for me to talk about my mom every day. Like I want to talk about my mom every day, but I have no one with who I can talk about her if it's not
You're
on my
here.
Instagram. Exactly.
You're here.
I'm here. But on my everyday's life, I see people, they don't ask me like, how are you? How are you feeling? Like, so definitely it started as a therapy. It started as a need to talk about my mom. Then it's ended up being a way to share my story, and then to listen to other people's story, and then just give a platform so listeners who might not have the gut to talk about their grief, or who might not want to have an Instagram just for this, they're still able to listen or to read those quotes, and it just makes them feel better. And when I realized I was helping even one person, and then two person and three person, and I was getting the feedback, I just kept going. And now it's been 3 months, and I don't know where it's going, but
That
I'm
is
going to
awesome.
continue sharing stories because it's helping people around us.
And that's what it's about. And I mean, that's how we connected. It was you reaching out and,
Mm-hmm.
seeing, if I could share my story on your account and then vice versa. And I think that you are so right. Even if it's one person that feels accompaniment in that
Yeah.
process and doesn't feel alone. I mean, I say that in the intro of this podcast. I created this podcast so that people that are going through grief can feel like they're not the only ones going through that they can relate to somebody else's grief. And like you said, it's not that we can completely fully say, oh, I know exactly what you're going through. No, I have a glimpse of what you're going through because
Yeah.
I went through something similar. My mom passed away from pancreatic cancer. Your mom passed away from pancreatic cancer. I know what it is to not be able to like
Yes.
turn off the phone at night because you don't know when you're going to
Yeah.
get that call,
And
so I
waiting the scan
can
results and
yes,
seeing the person getting so sick at the end. That's what I'm saying.
yes,
Every loss is unique, but there is a common thread, and we can still, understand and have compassion for each other.
absolutely.
And it's this empathy that lacks from people who haven't been through loss, and they really try to understand, but they don't. And that's why very early on people maybe stop checking on you, or they stop asking about your grief process or how you're feeling.
Mm.
And it's really that lonely place that made me want to have this platform.
Well, the great thing is that you did something that you knew you needed for your own
Mm-hmm.
grief journey, and that in that process you realized that it was able to help others. And
Yeah.
so there's that's the gratitude component and the growth that comes from that, because then you found this other community of people in your grief journey that you would have not found otherwise had you not been
Mm-hmm.
going through something
That's
yourself.
right.
So it just opened up your circle of
Yeah.
friendship and community to be a little bit different. And even and again, when we're grateful for certain things, it doesn't mean we wish that we're happy something that we're happy that we lost our
Mm-hmm.
moms, or that we're happy. That's not what it means when we find
No.
gratitude. It's just being grateful for the fact that we are able to wake up every day, that still remembering our
Yeah.
loved ones in our heart, and being able to share their story in one way or another, and also being able to help others that are going through their journey. So before we finish off, Patricia, let people know how it is that they can find you on Instagram, so that they can.
So my Instagram is Neshama Journey. So it's Neshama Journey. And Neshama means soul in Hebrew. And after my mother passed, I realized that we could still have a connection between our souls. And now we're on our own journey. I'm sure her soul has her own journey now in the afterlife, and my soul's journey is still here in this realm, but there's still a connection, and there will always be a connection. So that's what the
Beautiful.
Instagram is about the soul
I
journey.
love I love that, and I'll put it on the show notes too. I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for
Thank you so
sharing
much, Kendra.
your story. One thing, what is your mom's name?
Shelly.
Kelly?
Shelly.
Kelly. How do you
No,
pronounce?
Shelly. Shelly.
Oh yeah,
Shelly.
Shelly. Yeah, Shelly. Okay, Shelly. Shelly. Okay, just because I know we talk about our mom, and then we forget.
Yeah.
Like, wait, there was a name. So Shelly. Thank you for Shelly also for bringing you to this world as well, and the person that you are, and that even though she's passed on, she gave you certain tools even in the time that she was alive, to
Mm-hmm.
be able to give you that gift of being able to
Yeah.
grieve in such grace as well and give to others. So thank you to her as
Thank you so much, Kendra.
well. Thank
For
you.
having me.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so.
Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.